Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Hi, my name's Christo. As was noted, I'm a historian whose doctoral research kind of focused in on Pierre Trudeau, and largely his relationships with organized labor and the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation / New Democratic Party. So Gary was kind enough to invite me to come and speak a little bit about those connections that, some direct and some indirect ways really tie in to the various events happening in 1969. And, Trudeau's really interesting in this regard because he has this long ideological transformation. In his youth, Trudeau is rather nationalistic up until he goes off to university abroad. He goes to study at Harvard, spends brief time in Paris before starting but not finishing a doctorate at the London School of Economics. But before all of this, he's sympathetic to a kind of corporatist nationalism in Quebec, which is, at the very least, fascist sympathetic, deeply, unambiguously anti-Semitic, and questions, the Canadian state in a kind of conservative direction. For instance, it's part of this community that if you go to the Notre Dame in Montreal still, there is a image of Mussolini on the stained glass murals there, symbolizing his importance to many Catholic populations in and around the time. Less sympathy for Hitler, let's say, but more for Franco and Mussolini, who were defenders of the Catholic faith, or at least perceived as such. But by the time he goes off into his young adulthood, he really starts to embrace a small L liberalism, and he comes back to Canada. And this has been interpreted as a socialism, given who he associates with. But my interpretation in my research and my interpretation kind of in this talk is that Trudeau kind of embodies this small L liberalism, which associates him with the left because at the time, even in its limited capacity, the Liberal Party was the party of Japanese internment. The Liberal Party was the party of if not enacting Duplessis' Padlock Act, then doing nothing to oppose it. It was the party that continued to deny the right to strike and bargain collectively in many cases. So Trudeau, the kind of small L liberal, looked to people like the CCF and looked to labor leaders and labor trade unionists as early allies in that liberal project to, quote-unquote, bring liberalism to Quebec. Now, of course, Maurice Duplessis was a liberal, because often, as many liberals are wont to do, they associate, small L liberalism with the good things of liberalism, the liberty and what have you, so much as that is probably non-existent. But the point is with Duplessis, he was dedicated first and foremost to the primacy of private property, which is the core aspect of liberalism. But Trudeau in that period forms this really strong relationship with organized labor. And this is why a lot of people, and you've probably heard this, see Trudeau as, a secret communist. You've heard this notion, or more accurately from a lot of mainstream liberal people who have done most of the scholarly work on Trudeau, is that he was, a kind of pragmatic social democrat who realized that the only way to make change in this country is through the Liberal Party. So he went to the Liberal Party and he made that change. And he is the father of all that is good with modern Canada, whether that's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or whether that's the 1969 decriminalizations, or whether that's, the rise of capital M multiculturalism, and there's other factors as well, that Trudeau is the kind of progenitor of this modern progressive Canada. And so this conference really ties into my research, at least in part, in challenging Trudeau's role in that. And rather, in my research, I focus on more of the kind of pure economic questions around trade union rights, politics of energy ownership and distribution, and things like that, to argue that Trudeau is rather the progenitor of neoliberalism in Canada. And it doesn't start with Mulroney or Chrétien or Martin, and it starts with Pierre Trudeau. And in a sense, the Just Society is this interesting phenomenon because it really is this notion that people read as a tabula rasa, as this blank slate, and they sort of imposed what they wanted on it. It was written by Ramsay Cook, famous Canadian historian, who was, before his allegiances to Trudeau, he was a member of the NDP, and he would write that Just Society speech for Pierre Trudeau. And many people assumed, and I think reasonably so, that it was a nod to greater economic equality. greater equality between the many and the few, if you will. In addition to all these other forms of hopes people pinned on it, whether it was gender equality, whether it was, equality between French and English Canadians or what have you, equality between, the French, like the Franco-Anglo old stock and the wave of new European immigrants who are relatively recent. These were all the kind of hopes that people pinned on it. But at the end of the day, for workers at least, it was kind of a red herring. And what typified Trudeau's kind of general approach, if I can distill it down, it was one, a resistance to kind of collective rights, which Gary talked about in his introduction. And two, it was his deep concern about expectations. Both in public and in private, Trudeau feared one thing above all, and that was regular people having high expectations, specifically in economic terms, and to a certain degree in social terms. He was worried that the post-war period had given the average working man and working woman too great a hope for the future, that their wages would continue to be strong, that they would have good social programs, that there would be continuing levels of relative equality. As we know, there were still deep inequalities in the early post-war period, but as far as the aggregate between, say, the top 10 and bottom 10% of income holders, we've never gotten to that level of equality again in modern capitalist society as we were in Canada and the United States in that brief 30-year window. Trudeau didn't want that to continue. So from his earliest days in power, even before the War Measures Act, Trudeau would give interviews about how, we have to stop this keeping up with the Joneses thing. Trudeau, of course, was a personal millionaire in of himself. The hypocrisy reeked off this man all the time, right? That this idea that regular people, they shouldn't expect good social programs. The government shouldn't be a Santa Claus to them, sounding like a Fox News kind of commentator. Regular people just want the government to give them free stuff and things like this. Of course, these things paid for by taxes largely levied from working and middle class people. And so in this sense, he kind of created this notion of expectations. And this was intertwined with the crisis of inflation that was kind of ravaging the Western capitalist nations in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And he used this to justify what would be called wage and price controls. That would basically limit the right of workers in unionized environments from bargaining collectively to the fullest extent. Basically, a deep kind of restriction on the right to bargain collectively and the right to strike. And while there were price controls, they were almost universally ineffective. But wage controls were actually quite effective. So the effect of wage controls, at first kind of in a semi-voluntary program in the early 60s or early 70s, known as the Price and Incomes Commission, and then eventually in wage and price controls in the mid-1970s. Maybe many of you know. Is anybody here at the 1976 protest? No? There was 1 million workers that went on a one-day strike in 1976 to protest those controls. So it was one of the biggest one-day strike in Canadian history by far. And then in the early 1980s, specifically on federal public servants, the 6 and 5 anti-inflation program, which capped wages for federal public servants. In none of these cases were the controls on capital effective, on their ability to price goods, but always very effective on the ability to control workers' wages. And again, this was couched in the need to fight inflation, but if you read the kind of Trudeau's philosophical rants, and if you read the internal policies of the government, it was really predicated, this notion of what Trudeau saw as a just society was about challenging the greed of regular people. Regular people through their unions were greedy. They were greedy because they demanded high wages. They were greedy because they demanded good schools and social programs. And he said that we have to stop this. We have to use the force of the state, sometimes the force of law, other times, the force of direct state violence. Trudeau would say that, he would kind of threaten to bludgeon workers if they continued to protest him, making Doug Ford probably blush with the rhetoric, frankly. The reality is that in all of these cases, the goal was clear. You have to break down workers' hope for the future, because that is driving inflation. Now, while this is happening, there wasn't a necessary effort to kind of control workers or the expectations of the wealthy. Trudeau, of course, had a very fancy pool installed at 24 Sussex Drive, during these debates. Trudeau would, continue to talk about the need to free people from tradition. And this could be construed, I think, and during my original research, frankly, I didn't see this given my own cultural blindness, the traditions of Indigenous people. But I think he means all forms of traditions that hold back the truly great. Almost an Ubermensch kind of idea, that the liberal read kind of like white, straight, male, educated, individual is held back, be it by stultifying Christianity or by the indigenous cultures of the land, or by things like community, or by trade unions, which bring a measure of equality and to workplaces. And there's this idea that you have to free yourself from this. So greed is good. Gordon Gekko is right, but not when greed comes from the masses of people. Greed is good when it comes from the liberated individual. And even if you want to look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms now includes, as of 2016, the right to strike. It has been read in a recent Supreme Court decision. And in 2008, the right to bargain collectively was read in. But if you examine Trudeau's understanding of the Charter, those rights were not originally included. People like Sven Robinson, who's now making a return to politics, was a kind of champion to include the right to bargain collectively, but he was only one member on that committee that drafted the Charter. The Liberal and Conservative members were not in agreement. And right after that is when one of these wage control programs came in. So, if I could kind of sum up, the reality is that, the Just Society was set as this myth that Canada was going to become more equal in gendered terms, more equal in the kind of French-English divide, that many people were still in the notion that Canada was a nation of two great peoples, excluding the first peoples that were here, that it would be the equality of classes, but it wasn't to be the case. Rather, it was the kind of battering down of working class people's expectations. And while a lot of the formal apparatus of neoliberalism come under Mulroney, and then especially under Chrétien and Martin, in the kind of from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, is the kind of construction of neoliberal Canada in its direct form. Trudeau lays the intellectual framework. Trudeau talks about how workers need to work more hours, not less. He says workers need to earn less wages, not more. Canada, to be competitive, needs poorer workers. He talked about trickle-down economics. He said the only way your jobs will be safe is if you take lower wages and work longer hours. Because if you don't, somebody in Japan or somebody in the developing world will take those jobs and they'll never come back. So it's like, be happy with what you have. Frankly, be happy with a little bit less, because you should expect nothing more, right? And that rhetoric didn't play directly in yet. A lot of the changes took time, but this was the ideological and intellectual primer that Brian Mulroney used, that Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin used, and frankly are still used to this day. And so a lot of historians have talked about this, a lot of industrial relation experts have talked about this, that if you've ever seen those graphs that chart productivity growth and wage growth, usually following one another from about 1945 to about 1975, the break in Canada comes from Pierre Trudeau's dual assault, the assault through law, through wage and price controls, which controls workers' ability to bargain, and the intellectual assault that workers were being unreasonable and demanding decent wages and decent social programs and what have you. And that kind of creates this gap. And as we've seen, it continues to grow. So in some ways, the Just Society was not necessarily equality, but it was a kind of form of liberty for a particular kind of individual. And it was an idealized individual. And maybe today, under Justin Trudeau's liberalism, that can include, to a certain degree, racialized people, as long as they don't oppose him in cabinet. But the reality is that at Trudeau's time, it really felt like this was a liberty for a kind of white man just like him. And it was no coincidence that he was so popular amongst the press club punditry. Educated men who were now liberated from the sexual constraints of the past in a way women weren't yet, the first wave of sexual revolution. And it was all about this kind of freedom. So I think this is something we need to talk about more, because it really challenges the notion of, well, what was liberty, what was freedom, what was equality to a person like Trudeau? And I would argue that it's a form of equality levied on regular people, however we want to define that.